All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. We're looking at Egypt's absolutely staggering New Delta project today. Honestly, it's an infrastructure marvel that forces us to ask a really profound question. What actually happens when we try to play God with the desert? Just try to feel the scorching heat for a second, the miles and miles of barren sand. Because we're about to explore one of the most audacious, expensive, and high-stakes engineering experiments in modern human history. To really wrap your head around the sheer scale of this, imagine that you're standing right in the middle of that seemingly infinite expanse of the Sahara. The heat is totally oppressive, and the sand under your feet is completely lifeless. How exactly do you engineer a river through all of that to build a future for millions of people? I mean, it sounds like straight-up science fiction, right? But as we're going to see, it's rapidly becoming a hard, engineered reality.
And the driving force behind this monumental effort really comes down to a brutal mathematical reality. 160 million. That's Egypt's projected population by the year 2050. That is a massive, accelerating surge from the roughly 120 million residents living there today in 2026. This isn't just a statistic. It's literally a ticking clock for a nation that simply does not have the physical space to put everyone.
Seriously, just look at the claustrophobia of this situation. 95% of Egyptians are crammed onto just 5% of the country's land, basically hugging the banks of the Nile River and its delta. You've got cities that are just bursting at the seams. And, to make matters worse, that historic delta, it's currently sinking, and it's facing severe saltwater intrusion from rising sea levels. The math of survival just doesn't work without expanding their livable territory.
So, to escape this kind of catastrophic overcrowding and, honestly, the looming threat of dire food shortages, Egypt's government devised a massive solution. They are reclaiming 2.2 million fadans of deep desert for agriculture. To put that into perspective for you, they're trying to expand their arable land by an area larger than the entire U.S. state of Delaware. They aren't just out there planting a few trees, They're trying to build an entirely new ecosystem from scratch.
But here's the catch, and it's a big one. They can't just tap the Nile for this. The river is already super strained, especially with those upstream dams being built over in Ethiopia. So their strategy is wildly innovative. They're actually collecting massive amounts of agricultural drainage and wastewater. They're treating it at a record-breaking scale. We're talking up to 7.5 million cubic meters a day at a single facility, and then pumping that reclaimed water uphill through artificial rivers straight into the sand.
Which brings us to the next part of our explainer, the ecological backlash, fighting nature.
Look, you cannot force an arid, ancient ecosystem to completely change its nature without facing some serious pushback. Pumping millions of gallons of water into a desert comes with unpredictable and, frankly, incredibly severe environmental complications. On one hand, sure, the intended outcome is this green, fertile utopia to protect Egypt from global food shocks. But on the other side, the reality risks severe ecological backlash. You're completely altering the local hydrology, and relying on treated wastewater brings up the very real danger of polluted agricultural runoff contaminating this brand new environment.
Actually, perhaps the biggest, most insidious environmental threat here is soil salinity. Picture this. You're out there when the midday sun hits. When you pump water into that brutal desert heat, the water evaporates incredibly fast. And when it evaporates, it leaves salt behind. It turns into this vicious cycle, where over time a toxic crust of salt accumulates, completely destroying the soil structure and rendering the land totally infertile.
And I really want to emphasize that this is not just some theoretical warning drawn up by modern scientists. We are literally dealing with the ghosts of the past here. Ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, some of the earliest agricultural powerhouses in human history, collapsed into dust because they failed to manage this exact problem of salt accumulation in arid environments. It's a pretty haunting historical precedent.
Plus, the environmental hurdles just keep stacking up. Treating all that water and constantly pumping it uphill requires enormous continuous energy. And yeah, while they can use solar power, that introduces some really difficult trade-offs. Solar panels require massive amounts of land they desperately want to use for farming. Plus, solar doesn't entirely solve the need for the absolute rock-solid baseline power you need to keep those massive pumps running 24/7 to keep the desert green.
All right, moving on to perhaps the most fascinating part, the human experiment. Social engineering. This brings us to a complication that might actually be even harder than moving millions of cubic meters of water. Moving the people. You can build the canals and treat the water all day long, but an agricultural paradise doesn't just run itself. Put yourself in their shoes for a second. If you lived in a vibrant, established community along the historic Nile, where your family has lived for generations, where the culture and the markets actually are, would you voluntarily pack up your entire life to go farm experimental sand in the middle of absolutely nowhere? It's a massive ask, and it really is the central human dilemma of this whole project.
So to convince everyday citizens to become these modern desert pioneers, the government is having to pull a lot of levers. They're offering subsidized land leases to make it financially irresistible, and they're aggressively recruiting young agricultural graduates to bring in fresh energy. And notably, this entire massive social and physical undertaking is being managed under the heavy execution and oversight of the Egyptian military, really leaning on their capacity to execute these mega projects.
And to actually survive out there, these young pioneers definitely can't use the farming methods of their grandparents. They're deploying cutting-edge precision agriculture. We're talking about incredibly efficient drip irrigation, sending moisture directly to the plant roots, real-time soil sensors constantly monitoring moisture and nutrients, and drone surveillance, keeping a watchful eye on crop health from above. All of this just to coax wheat, tomatoes, and olives from the sand.
Yet, as we look at this tech-heavy approach, we run into a really fascinating and difficult irony. Egypt is desperately trying to establish and run this high-tech agricultural paradise, a system that absolutely requires brilliant technical minds to sustain. But simultaneously, the country is fighting a massive brain drain. Many of its brightest engineers and scientists are immigrating abroad seeking better economic opportunities. Retaining the talent to actually run this desert miracle is a constant, ongoing battle.
Which brings us to our final section, a monumental global gamble.
When you zoom out and look at the big picture, it becomes super clear that we are watching a high-stakes, real-time gamble that extends way beyond Egypt's borders. The whole world is watching this, because the stakes are truly existential. If it fails, the consequences are staggering. We're talking financial ruin for an already strained economy, lasting ecological scarring on the landscape, and a tragic waste of resources. But if it succeeds, it means domestic food security, massive job creation, and most importantly, a proven global model for survival in an era of accelerating climate change.
Regardless of the ultimate outcome, the project is already well underway. With thousands of workers currently out there carving canals, laying massive pipelines, and planting seeds where literally nothing is grown for millennia, the undeniable reality is that the Sahara isn't just sand anymore. The transformation has definitely begun.
So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. As we push the absolute boundaries of technology to fight against nature's ancient limits, is Egypt's New Delta project a brilliant, necessary blueprint for humanity's survival on a changing planet? Or will history record it as a tragic, costly monument to our own overreach? Thanks for exploring this with me today, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.